Hello and welcome to one of my AQA Sociology A-level screencasts. Today's screencast will be focused on globalisation of the healthcare industry, which falls into the latter section of the specification for paper 2 in topics in sociology. Now, there are a range of areas, as you can see from this diagram, are worth looking into in relation to globalisation and health, and this screencast is going to introduce you to some of these ideas so you know that if you had a question on the globalisation of health, which did come up last year, what you could put into it. The first impact that this screencast is going to address is migration, and this is a particularly hot topic at the moment in relation to the Brexit debates and negotiations, and the fact that actually without migration the NHS itself would not stay afloat. There's a huge proportion of our doctors and our nurses that come from overseas who work in the British healthcare system. It's much easier to recruit from developing societies due to the sort of sense of opportunity that Britain can provide, and also there have been a significant amount of healthcare professionals who have been somehow poached from abroad, have been enticed to come over to the UK and work for us. Now, this is arguably a negative of globalisation, the globalisation process, as it's meaning that the healthcare professionals that are in the developing world, which arguably have a lot of healthcare problems themselves, are being taken away from those environments where they're most needed and brought here to keep our system afloat, which throws into question what's going on in our system. However, in terms of the NHS, we're very, very grateful for all the support we get from the workers in other countries. Now, a key part of discussing globalisation in the healthcare industry is linked to the pharmaceutical industry. Now, we have examined the pharmaceutical industry as we've looked at particularly Marxist perspectives on healthcare. However, I think the most important thing to know is that there are 5 major companies where most drugs are produced, companies like GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer, which demonstrates a bit like when we look at this in the media, when there are very, very limited organisations who own the majority of the world's media with the Murdoch empire. Very similar things happening in terms of drugs and pharmaceuticals. Because of this, and they have so much power and so much influence, the NHS itself has very limited influence over what drugs become produced, and because of that as well, the NHS have very limited influence on the price that's set by pharmaceutical companies. Now, because they are the main providers of these drugs, the NHS has no choice where it buys them from, and so it can't really either change the price that they're buying the drugs at, but it also can't change the price that they're then selling the drugs on in forms of prescriptions and things like this. So this throws into question, is the NHS actually a British healthcare system, or are we actually controlled and influenced and dominated by these globalised organisations who have a huge influence over our medical profession? So linking on from the pharmaceutical companies, we see an increase in medicalisation, which we addressed in the first sort of few lessons when we were looking at the biomedical model of health and some of the problems of the biomedical model of health. But there's this idea that within the globalised pharmaceutical companies, they're widening the boundaries of diagnosis, and we've looked at this in relation to mental illness, but they are making conditions in need of treatment either by putting things in the DSM or noticing that there's a gap in the market for perhaps a condition which requires medication, and by doing that they make huge profits from the drugs that they use to so-called fix these so-called problems. So examples that we've looked at is female sexual dysfunction. So we see that there are drugs for erectile dysfunction, which seems to kind of be a legitimate healthcare problem, but female sexual dysfunction is something that's a bit more debated, whether it actually is a medical problem. It kind of is a question, but pharmaceutical organisations globally identify that this is perhaps an area where there's a gap in the market. They see this and can make huge profits from it, exactly the same as when we see the DSM increasing the criteria for what is abnormal behaviour. Once you've identified that there's some abnormal behaviour, you can then attribute a drug to try and fix it, and that then makes huge profits for these organisations. As well as this, we see the same drug being packaged up and marketed in different ways to sell more and to make more money. And you see this even in any of the chemists that you can go to. You can buy paracetamol that is non-branded, and then you can buy paracetamol that is branded by organisations such as Panadol. Same for ibuprofen. You can buy it non-branded, but you can also buy it as Nurofen. And the ingredients, the contents of those drugs are exactly the same, but the organisations are managing to make a huge amount of profit out of the drugs that you buy because of the brand. So that's kind of linking into the capitalist system, and we see that it's more of a profit-making scheme than necessarily caring about the patients themselves. Having said this, patents are introduced from governments that businesses apply to, which basically gives the organisations an exclusive right to produce and market their brand of the drug for a section of time. It's normally around 20 years. And what this means is that drug companies have kind of monopoly, they have control, they have authority, and basically, control over the drug in question, so no one else can produce a cheaper and more affordable or different non-brand alternative, which means that there's no element of competition there. They've bought out the market. They are the sole provider of that drug. This means that those companies can keep drug prices incredibly high because there's no one that's competing with them. They don't have to provide competitive prices. So this again is an increasing problem with globalisation, because not only are they kind of being that only organisation in the country that is in charge of that drug, they're actually sometimes the only company in the world that is in charge of that drug. And if you have control over one drug, the amount of power that you have, and you can charge as much as you want if that drug is seeming to fix patients. So there is some, arguably from different sociological perspectives, perhaps some problems, some corruption, some negativity that comes from actually something that's supposed to be making patients better and for the benefit of everyone's health. Now, most of the sociological points that I'm making today come from Goldacre and Law, and they have made various statements in relation to the sort of big pharma ideas. And one of the key findings that these sociologists have presented is that the scientific evidence that is produced, whenever you produce a drug, you have to kind of produce a report and suggest that there's evidence to suggest that it works. But a lot of the scientific evidence that is written is distorted by the pharmaceutical industry, and they'll take one part of the percentages and frame it in a way that makes it appear positive. Now, that means that the pharmaceutical companies are hugely selective in what they present. They don't present the findings of all clinical trials. They present the findings of the successful clinical trials, and they'll also employ ghostwriters, and these are people who write the evidence up, but you can't attribute them back to a pharmaceutical company, or you can't trace them back to a particular set of scientific research, which means that no one's really to blame if something goes wrong. And it's a bit worrying and a bit scary that these are some of the things that are happening, but it is happening in terms of how scientific evidence is presented. Now, because we're talking about healthcare on a global scale here, inequality is something that we do need to address, because we know that within the Western world, in the UK, in America, in Canada, we have a significant amount of good quality healthcare. And whilst America has a very different system to us, we have access to drugs, medical drugs, quite easily. And the thing that's really, really sad is that actually 90% of spending on drugs is only going to cure 10% of the world's population, and those 10% of the world's population fall into the Western world. basically what's happening is drug companies recognise that it's the wealthiest countries in the world that are going to be able to afford their drugs and going to be able to afford a range of the drugs. So they focus on finding cures and finding treatments for diseases that tend to affect the wealthiest the most. And we've looked at these ideas of diseases of affluence, things like obesity, things like lung cancer, things like heart disease, that come from the fact that people have got money. And they do not focus on drugs that help issues of, diseases of poverty from the past, which do affect lots of the non-Western world still today. So the globalized industry is making this inequality that exists in society even worse. In addition to this, the global companies have access to participants to run clinical trials on their clinical trials of their drugs on humans from across the world, and they often choose volunteers from the poorest groups in society, perhaps because they can get away with paying them very little for being part of the clinical trial. Perhaps people there are more likely to say that they'll take part because they're kind of keen and interested, or they are hoping that it could lead to more opportunities in the future and that less income than perhaps you'd have access to in Western world. So basically what's happening is that drugs are trialed on these human guinea pigs from the poorest groups in society, but they're normally groups that are never going to benefit from the production of these drugs, because, as we said before in the previous section, that most of the drugs that are produced are for 10% of the world's population. And the other thing that's happening is we're beginning to see an increase in what we call medical tourism, where people are going abroad to gain medical treatment to either beat the queues of the NHS or beat the price of private healthcare in this country. So doctors recognise that this is a very profitable industry. If they're a specialist in something like plastic surgery or hip and joint replacements, they could find themselves actually as more of businessmen. They've got those skills. They can set up their own private practice somewhere abroad where they can get a lot of patients in who are paying enough money, but they're not paying as much as maybe they would be paying in Britain, and the system gets undercut then by people basically going abroad to get treatment. Now, in terms of evaluating what is going on here, it's evident that the pharmaceutical companies, and you would expect from the name pharmaceuticals, are focusing on the biomedical approach to disease. And by focusing on that approach, you don't tend to see as much research or interest into preventing illness from starting in the first place. Why would an organisation that makes huge amounts of profit from people being ill want to prevent people from getting ill in the first place? So less money spent on these preventative measures, and that begins to suggest that actually the organisation is about self-interest. It's about the search for profit. It's not about making people better, making people happy, making people healthy. And you have to call into question, in terms of an AO3 point here, of are they really doing it to help people, or is there some kind of profit motive involved, which obviously the Marxists have got a whole load of things to say about. But the other perspectives would also agree with this to some extent. And just a real key, I know I've already mentioned this idea of medical tourism, but a real key process that is going on in the globalisation of healthcare is we see patients crossing borders to get medical treatment, and some countries have very strict rules on what can be transplanted in terms of organs. Now, if they're not available in your home country, fly somewhere else where you'll be able to get hold of those organs. And it's happening because healthcare is quite a challenge in Britain, and there are long waiting times, and it's expensive if you go private. And it's possible because we've got transport, we've got communication, and everything is so much more accessible that it's really easy to do this. I hope you found this summary of globalisation of healthcare useful. You need to return to your lesson notes and lesson PowerPoints to get a little bit more depth of this. But if you had a question, there are a selection of ideas and a selection of debates that you could talk about here, and it's just making sure that you've got those AO3 evaluation points which you can develop on your own to ensure you get marks in these questions.